All right. Hi. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Louisiana Creole Research Association's 16th Annual Conference, also known as La Creole. My name is Chantal Nabon, and I am the current chair of the Board of Directors. On behalf of our 7-member board, La Creole's administration, and the entire organization, we are so grateful to have you all here today. I want to give a special thanks to our 2020 conference committee, led by La Creole's co-founder and charter member, Mrs. Pat Scheckschneider. Also our conference program chair, Dr. Elizabeth Rhodes. And many special thanks to those facilitating this meeting webinar, our tech team, our administrative manager, Helen Marie, and Mike Murphy. And all of who I've named are all longtime members of our organization. This is a monumental move for us as we embark on our first virtual public event in our 16-year history. And with over 200 of us here from all over the country and the world, we have some international guests with us. We hope that you enjoyed this year's conference. It's a panel presentation entitled Antiracism, Colorism, and Creole Identity. And it features a dynamic group of individuals to speak on these relevant topics. So now I would like to introduce to you our moderator for this time, Dr. Wendy Golden. Wendy Golden is an essayist, a bead worker, and a poet, an American historian, and the proud descendant of Louisiana Creoles who migrated to California. Her training as a historian took place at California State University, Louisiana State University, and New York University, where she earned her doctorate in history. Her dissertation research includes oral histories of Creoles in New Orleans, Pointe-à-la-Hache, Lafayette, Grand Couteau, and Los Angeles. Her nonfiction writing delves into the themes of race and belonging, skin color and ancestry, colonialism and family narratives, migration, sexuality, oral history, hybridity, and Louisiana. Her publications have appeared in the Indiana Review, the North American Review, Puerto del Sol, the Rappahannock Review, and New Orleans Review, and About Place Journal. Recently, she was awarded a writer's residency at a studio in the woods, where she will continue writing her original manuscript on the history of Creole Louisiana for LSU Press. She lives in New Orleans and teaches at Xavier University of Louisiana. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Wendy Golden.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the invitation to moderate this panel with 3 folks whose work I respect, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. I will be moderating the panel, and I will be introducing our 3 panelists. And first, I will talk a little bit, I'm going to tell a very short story about my research when I moved here to New Orleans from California, just as a way to connect the themes that we are talking about, the themes which are racism, colorism, anti-racism, colorism, and Creole identity. And I do want to say that I find these topics to be dynamic, and they are also timely. And I think in some ways, they're also challenging, and they're also sensitive and very difficult. Particularly, I find when teaching my classes and talking with others, I find terminologies sometimes challenging. And terminologies around skin color are, in my opinion, especially challenging. We have very limited language like light-skinned or dark-skinned or brown or bright or olive or fair. And these terms don't really, in my opinion, say very much. But when we're talking about colorism, we're talking about Creole as a cultural experience, as a category that overlaps race in some ways. These terms are sometimes used. So when I first moved to New Orleans from the place where I was getting my doctorate, but I was raised in Southern California by folks who lived here and migrated there in the 1930s and 40s. When I first came here to do my research, I was conducting oral histories with all sorts of people, Creole identified people in South Louisiana. And one of the first people I interviewed was my grandmother's second cousin. Her name was Mercedes. And I went to Miss Mercedes' house to interview her and to talk to her about being Creole. And this was 19 years ago. And so I went to her house to interview her, to talk to her about the subject. And she was a blue-eyed woman with white, beautiful snow white hair. And I would describe her vaguely as being much lighter skinned than me. And when we started having this conversation, and I asked her, so tell me about your life as a Creole. And she said to me, oh, no, don't use that word Creole. It's a sensitive word. It's going to make people think that you feel a certain way, that maybe you're prejudiced, or they might have some negative associations. She said, you should strictly use the word Black or maybe Afro Creole. And so because I was new here, I took note and I was very careful about using the word Creole thereafter. And maybe about 2 weeks later, I was about to conduct another interview in Plaquemines Parish, in a region outside of Point Lahash called Grand Bayou. And to get to the subjects, the people that I was going to interview, I actually had to get on a boat and take the boat into Grand Bayou, which is where these very generous people offered to let me interview them. So I got out of the car with my host and got into the boat, and we rowed this boat out to the camp where these folks lived. And before we got out of the boat, my host said, by the way, do not use the term Black. You must use the term Creole when you interview these folks. And so I said, okay, I will not use the term Black, I will use the term Creole. And he said, well, you don't know their history, so just follow along. So we got out of the boat at the dock and walked into these people's house, and they were very, very deep brown-skinned folks, and much darker than I am, and beautiful people. And I was told, absolutely do not use the term Black. And so I'm telling this story for a number of reasons. One is that the two people that I spoke to who informed me of what language I should and should not use, both of them were Creole. And both of them felt that they were shielding me from possible conflict by innocently using terminology that in Southern California I may have used without thinking about some of the implications that were present here in Louisiana. And also, as a result of these two interactions, I noted that one of the themes of my work was going to be incorporating all of these terms and making sure that the work that I do does not further deepen racist assumptions and further deepen color assumptions that are sometimes associated with Creoles. And so the story, both of these interactions stand out to me. And I thought that they would maybe open the door to this conversation about colorism, anti-racism, and Creole identity. So I am going to introduce our first panelist. Our first panelist is Bailey Duhay. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, and her subject is cultural anthropology. Bailey's dissertation is based on ethnographic research with New Orleans Creoles of color. Her research looks at questions of racial fluidity, generational trauma, critical mixed race studies, and American Blackness, and varieties of American Blackness. The goal of her research is to produce scholarship that challenges understandings of race and interrogates the many ways that we're taught how to race, as if race is actually an action. And maybe it is. Bailey's on track to finish her PhD in May 2021. And she's actively seeking employment with organizations that are committed to social justice, to advocacy, and to education. So thank you, Bailey, for being here. And in between each panelist, I will provide some biographical information, and then our panelists will really introduce everyone to themselves. So thank you for being here, and go ahead, Bailey.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you to the Law Creole Conference Committee for their work in putting this together, and to my fellow panelists and Wendy, our moderator. I'm looking forward to a very great discussion. We had a brief meeting this morning to check technology and just check in, and the conversation was already so robust, and I'm looking forward to extending that and including all of you. So thank you all for here listening and participating with us today. So a little bit about me. I am born and raised New Orleans. I identify as Creole and also mixed race. My dad and my dad's family is from New Orleans, born and raised Creoles, and my mom is white. And so I have come to the conversation on Creole identity a little bit differently, perhaps than some, identifying as Creole, identifying as Black Creole, and also identifying as a mixed race individual. And so this is how it is influenced how I understand race and how I teach race. And I'm also a cultural anthropologist. And so my question of race and my question of looking at how we understand race comes through that lens of looking at the culture and the structure that's created the concepts of race that we use today. And so I study mixed race American experiences, and my research focuses on Creoles in New Orleans. And so I'm actually in the attendees list, I'm seeing several folks that I've interviewed and that I have on schedule to interview, which is very exciting to be speaking directly to the folks that this research is about as well. And so for my opening remarks, we're keeping opening remarks brief to have lots of time for discussion. So I want to focus on two main things. The first of which is how anti-racism work can be done today, and sort of hitting on that theme right off the bat. And the second is what that perhaps means for Creoles. And so to start, I want to contextualize how I understand anti-racism work for myself, and specifically that is through education. And so I teach college courses for the University of Colorado right now on race. And the way that I teach race is with the exception, is with a mixed race example as the start. If we understand race being a social construction, then by starting with the exception, which for my class, I focus on the Creole story and history, I can start race from a place of illustrating the constructed nature, which means we can blow it out of the water and understand it as a lived reality and get past some of the uncomfortable moments and the moments of tension that often come up when we start talking about race. And so, like Wendy's story that she started with, I when I started my work that has informed my teaching, and that's for my dissertation, I started asking questions to my own family and to our community of, okay, what does it mean to be Creole? And was met with a little bit of resistance originally. Oh, don't use that word, don't talk about that. That's an inside of the house conversation. And interestingly, over time, having this conversation and pushing forward and discussing this has sort of opened up many stories, many discussions, and what I argue are many moments of healing for some of the generational traumas that are often seen in Creole stories that we know are sometimes themes throughout many Creole families. Stories of passing, stories of not recognizing family or registering different family members because of the historical moment. And so my own research ties in with my education and looking at anti-racism work really through education and learning that history first. And so that's why I tell the story of the research and the teaching together for me, because they work together to illustrate that anti-racism work is anti-racism work, regardless of who you are. And that involves educating yourself on your history, reflecting, and then looking at the ways within your community that you can make those sustainable and visible changes. And to Wendy's point in her opening remarks, for Creoles, this often means having the conversations or those uncomfortable moments of addressing colorism, of addressing generational privileges that have worked to privilege us to different classes in different ways for some of us, and to have these conversations as part of a Black American experience when we start to look at all the different ethnicities underneath this umbrella term of African American. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. These are some of my initial thoughts on the topic, and specifically looking at, for me, the focus that I would like to talk through today is how we can look at anti-racism work as Creoles, but also as individuals part of this structure. So what is unique about that Creole mixed race identity? And then also what we can do to push that conversation forward outside of our communities and families. So thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Bailey. I will introduce our next panelist, who will also make brief remarks and introduce us to his perspective, and that would be Dr. J.Q. Adams. He is a professor emeritus from Western Illinois University, where he taught for over 25 years in educational and interdisciplinary studies. His interest and experience in educational reform has impacted hundreds of schools across the Midwest region. He has conducted research for a variety of state and community institutions. Dr. Adams currently provides input for Nickelodeon in the area of cultural appropriateness for programs as well as character development. He's received numerous recognitions, the Distinguished Alumni Award from Grand Valley State University and the University of Illinois College of Education. He was also a National Association of Multicultural Educators, an Educator of the Year in 2009. So Dr. Adams, take it away.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Again, I'm trying to side on keeping remarks short, which is very difficult for me. Let me just tell you just a little bit about my background. I got started in the struggle very, very early, and I'm talking about the civil rights struggle. I was born in Gary, Indiana, but my great aunt, who was very involved in the civil rights movement, thought it'd be a great idea if she would come to Indiana, take myself and two of my siblings and bring them to Western Pennsylvania, to a town called Sharon, Pennsylvania. And in 1955, we were the first, what I would refer to as diaspora students to integrate Russell Street Elementary School. So again, my background in the struggle starts at a very, very tender age, and it has not relented in any way since that point in time. I think one other thing I need to tell you about that. How that came to be was the fact that my great uncle, Jim, was an octoroon and was living in an area of town that was segregated, and he was passing. My great aunt, who was very fair, probably would be considered a quadroon, allowed that circumstance to happen. But when we got there, as they would say, the gig was up. So I'm interested in the construction of race. I thought Bailey did a nice job of talking about that. And I'm very much interested in how it evolved. And it'd be very difficult to talk about what we're going to talk today without just a little smidgen of history in that regard. And obviously we have to talk about the age of discovery as Europe, climbs out of the dark ages. And that's a very interesting topic. I'd love to share stories about that because it certainly was thriving for the Moors, but it was the dark ages for the Europeans. But nonetheless, that kind of begins this age of discovery when they're out trying to colonize the world. And so some of these ideas, new scientific, and I would have to say pseudo-scientific ideas begin to come into play. And one of those definitely was the social construction of race. And we can track that back to a lot of different people, but I kind of think Blumenthal and Linnaeus probably the ball rolling with their typologies, and the fact that they were quickly taken from what was their science into what became social policy in terms of hierarchy of race. And so any encounter that Europeans had with distinctive groups, and especially phenotypically distinctive, they were considered to be non-whites. So this is where we encountered the difficulty or the problems, so to speak, and I just want to share with you a couple ideas on that. As Europeans adopt this social construction, they create this racial binary with white people being superior to all non-white persons. This change came at a great price because when a white person cannot see her or himself in the face of the non-whites with whom they share a place, they sever their connection with humanity. So I really want to emphasize that because I hope that comes up and we can talk about that more as the afternoon goes on. This has allowed whites to participate in or tolerate the genocide of indigenous peoples as well as the rape, lynching, and enslavement of millions. So my concern is, what do we do about the trappings of that in mind? What I mean by there is the language of race as it forms public policy, as it forms laws, and so forth. So I'm really working on dismantling what I refer to as the mirage of race. As Audre Lorde argued, you can't use the master's tools as language systems and ideas to dismantle the master's house. I choose not to see my identity as anything less than any other human. I now work on reframing the relationship in human terms to take that power away from the white dominant versus black subordinate in favor of my own self-realization, free of any binary or hierarchy. This, I believe, has to be the goal of true anti-racism, to have a dialogue that deconstructs race and repairs our collective connection to our humanity. So I know that's a chunk full right there, but I'm very pleased to be here and thankful, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you so much, JQ. I will introduce our third speaker, who will also talk a little bit about herself, introduce herself to us, and offer some opening comments. And then what we will do, I just want to let everyone know, what we will do is we will have some dialogue between the panelists. And as we engage in that dialogue, you are welcome as participants, you're welcome to to add questions that you would like to ask that we will address after the panelists engage with each other for a little while. And so our third panelist is the writer Bliss Broyard. She is the author of a book called One Drop, My Father's Hidden Life, A Story of Race and Secrets. The book recounts how her father, the New York Times literary critic Anatole Broyard, who was born a Creole of color, passed for white. Bliss found out at the age of 24, shortly before he died. One Drop recounts how Bliss traveled to New Orleans to meet the family that she never knew and to learn the history that had been kept from her. In the process, she examines the history of free people of color and racial categories like the binary that both Bailey and JQ mentioned. Bliss's writing has appeared in many publications, including the New York Magazine, NewYorker.com, Time, The Guardian, Elle, and O. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and her 2 children, and she has worked in school integration activism. So thank you for being here, Bliss, and I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golden. I'm really glad to be here and reconnect to my La Creole roots. When I was working on One Drop, I spent a lot of time down in New Orleans doing genealogical research, and I really benefited from the help with many members in this organization that I'm seeing here on the attendee list. I'm also really glad to be in dialogue with Bailey and JQ. I'm really interested in this idea that Bailey brings up about secrets being a legacy of Creole identity, and also what can Creoles bring to the anti-racism conversation. And then I'm also super committed to JQ's comment about the idea that dialogue is so necessary to repair our connection to a collective humanity. I'm a big believer in that. So I'm not a professor, I'm a writer. So I had to write down my thoughts, and I got the memo a little late to keep it shorter. So I'll try not to go on too long, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. So perhaps you, like me, have had this experience when you're in a meeting recently that would be on Zoom. And when it's your turn to introduce yourself, you're invited to include your preferred pronouns. In my case, I say Bliss Broyard, I go by she, her. And it's a way to support people whose identities fall outside the binaries of male and female. It acknowledges that there's sometimes a dissonance between how someone might appear and what they consider themselves to be. And this practice allows a participant to present themselves without a worry of someone mistaking their gender. And it also finally makes explicit our different orientations within a system where power has often been determined by gender. In the last few years, since this has become a regular practice, I'm always happy to provide my personal pronouns, but I've often found myself wishing for a similarly economic way when I'm meeting a group of people for the first time to explain my racial identity, since it also falls out of the simple binary of black and white, and what I am is not necessarily obvious by looking at me. Maybe some of you can relate to this desire. I don't know. Because my racial identity, informed by my family's history, also matters in the spaces that I find myself in, whether that's my children's integrating school in Brooklyn, an anti-racism workshop, or community meetings in my gentrifying Brooklyn neighborhood, which also happens to be the same neighborhood where my Creole father lived as a teenager, where he and his family were then considered Negroes in the 1920s and 30s. So my dad, Anatole Broyard, was born in 1920 at home in a shotgun shack on St. Anne's Street near the corner of North Galvez in New Orleans, right around the corner from Dookie Chase. May she rest in peace. And his parents were both Creoles of color. His dad came from a long line of carpenters, the Broyards, working with a crew of darker African-Americans, built many shotgun shacks and a few hotels and office buildings all around New Orleans. But then my father's family moved north in 1926 to Bedford-Stuyvesant, as part of the Great Migration, about a mile from where I live today. And being Creole, it didn't really mean that much in Brooklyn because they were out of their cultural context. There weren't any other Creoles here. But their light skin aligned them with other Black people whose ancestors had been free before emancipation, and they had more access to education and opportunity as a result. Even so, these advantages in light skin didn't help my grandfather when it came to trying to join the Carpenters Union, because people don't think about this, but in the North, there's just as much segregation as in the South often, and he couldn't be Black and be in the Carpenters Union in the 1930s, not until the 1960s. My grandmother also, she had to pass for white to get a job ironing in a commercial laundry. So they also identified as colored people in a poor neighborhood. They were subject to the same redlining and overcrowding practices that other Black people were. So as my dad was growing up in the 1920s and 30s, long before the Civil Rights Movement, he surveyed the landscape and his own parents' example, and he decided that he would just let people take him for white too. But he did it all the way. He didn't just do it for work. When he came back from the war, he started to become a writer. And eventually, as Wendy mentioned, he became the chief book critic for the New York Times. He was actually the first Black critic ever on staff there. In fact, he was the first Black critic on the staff of any national newspaper outside of Black newspapers, but nobody acknowledged his racial identity, although it was a kind of open secret. So my father, the way I think he explained this, is that he thought that the only person who had the right to define him was himself. And that has kind of an admirable ring to it, the spirit of American individuality and self-determination, until you start to think about the consequences, which I have done for the past 30 years since I discovered his secret on his deathbed when I was 24. So that would be cutting off ties from your family. He was hacking an unjust racist system for himself because he could, because of an accident of melatonin, but not doing anything really to change it for anyone else. It was only after his death that I learned about the histories that shaped him: slavery, segregation, the legacy of the gens du couleur libre, Creole identity, the jumping across the color line in his own family, and the civil rights movement that he turned away from, which many Creoles turned towards and in fact even helped found. I only learned afterward about the hurt and betrayal felt by his mother and his sisters, who he did cut out of his life. So as was mentioned up top, I wrote a book about my dad, trying to understand what this history and identity meant to him and what it means to me. And I traveled around the country after it was published, giving readings and meeting people with sometimes with similar stories. And always in the question and answer period, somebody would ask, how do you identify? And, how do you identify now? And the room would get kind of quiet. And even though I'd spent 7 years and written a 500-page book on the topic, it always seemed like everything was riding on how I answered that question. So sometimes I would say I'm part Creole and part Norwegian. That's my mother's ethnicity. Sometimes I would just say I'm biracial or I'm mixed. But it was hard for me to keep the question out of my voice, as if, looking like I do, I was expecting someone to jump up in the audience and tell me I had no right to claim that identity. Then I went on Professor Henry Louis Gates's show, African American Lives, which has become Finding Your Roots. Maybe some of you know that show. And he asked me the same question after revealing the results of a DNA test that showed that I had 17.2% sub-Saharan African ancestry. So I expanded on my usual answer by saying that I didn't think a DNA test or a discovery on a census record of a great-grandparent listed as Black or MU for mulatto had the ability to change my identity overnight. I think of my identity as the result of my lived experiences, and I hadn't grown up knowing I was Black or Creole, and that identity wasn't what people saw when they looked at me. So when the show was broadcast, I saw that the guest, he usually has 5 people on one episode, right before me was Chris Rock, the actor. And the last question he asked Chris Rock was whether there was some threshold of Blackness that made a person Black. And that Rock said that any bit of Blackness at all puts you in the matrix. That's how he put it. So then Gates introduced me before I was coming out as someone who didn't even know she was living in the matrix. And this framing made my answer to the question of how you identify seem like I was kind of hedging on claiming a Black identity, rather than me being wary about misappropriating an identity that I wasn't raised with and being respectful about the fact that I hadn't struggled the same way that people who are visibly Black had. Furthermore, I didn't want to submit to this kind of logic of one drop that had negatively impacted many people in New Orleans and across the South. It seemed to me that relying on this logic of blood only was problematic. But it was only this summer during the Black Lives Matters uprisings that I finally had a kind of epiphany about the question of how I identified. For those of us for whom our racial identity is somewhat elective or not apparent, it seems to me now that it's about where in the system of Black oppression and white privilege you locate yourself. Are you a victim, an oppressor, both at the same time? And even more importantly, where are you in this fight to dismantle this system? When COVID started, some young people in my neighborhood, they started a mutual aid organization, similar to the mutual aid societies that many of our ancestors belonged to. And the function of it was to do grocery shopping for seniors and for immunocompromised people. They started raising money and offering a stipend for those who were experiencing food insecurity. Because it's a gentrifying neighborhood, most of the people who were providing aid were white and privileged, and most of the people who are receiving it are Black, likely descendants of slaves themselves and low income. For the last 6 or 7 years, I've been very active in efforts to dismantle school and residential segregation in Brooklyn. A friend of mine recently pointed out that this desire to integrate people was a kind of healing for me, perhaps, but I also see it as like an essential way to heal the legacy of systemic racism in this country, kind of pointing to JQ's point. So over the summer, I got recruited to join this group, this mutual aid society, and work on some community building. So over the summer, I hosted a webinar, not unlike this one, but with only 90 people, where some longstanding community members, we call them our legacy residents, described for an audience of mostly white gentrifiers what it was like to live in a neighborhood your entire life and watch it slowly become unwelcoming to you. And the idea that understanding each other was the first step to finding some common ground. So another integration activist was helping me facilitate the meeting, and he suggested in the introductions that when we identified ourselves, we should include our pronouns, but we should also include our racial or ethnic identity, since a lot of the conversation was about race and privilege. So for example, he said he described himself as mixed race, European and Mexican, white passing. He said, white passing? I never encountered anyone claiming this phrase willingly. I only knew it in the context of my father's passing as a secret and something shameful. So I Googled it and I saw that white passing has recently become a thing, particularly among young people. I think the singer Halsey may have something to do with it, who I don't know her. She has a big hit called Without Me, but she has a Black father and a white mother. And she described herself in multiple interviews over the summer when talking about her participation in marches for George Floyd as mixed race, white passing. And it was a way of claiming her roots and her connection to the Black community and the insights and empathy that entails, while also acknowledging the fact that she doesn't experience the same kind of micro and macro aggressions as visibly Black people do. So as I thought about this definition, my role in this group of privileged, mostly white gentrifiers and mostly Black legacy residents became clearer, and my usual anxiety about someone challenging my right to understand either perspective subsided. So the meeting started. My name is Bliss Broyard, I said. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have mixed race, New Orleans Creole ancestry, and I'm white passing. Thanks.
All right, wonderful. So thank you, Bliss, and thank you, JQ and Bailey, for your introductory remarks. I took copious notes. So what I would like to do is ask Bailey or JQ if something that Bliss brought out was particularly notable to you, or if you would like to use your response as a jumping off point in our discussion. I also want to share with the participants that there's a I'm not sure what to call it, an image at the bottom of the screen where it says Q&A. That is where you want to type in your questions for our panelists. So I'm not sure, Bailey or JQ, did you want to respond to something that Bliss said, or did something stand out to you particularly about this idea of identities and how we articulate them being actually impermanent? They change over time, and we're challenged to articulate things that are often difficult to put into words in a way that's effective.
Well, I can respond quickly. Yeah, I do believe that identity is fluid. I do believe that each individual, each singularity has the right to choose their identity. I also believe that the language we use either keeps constructs alive or helps them dissipate and go away. And in terms of when we use language that derives from plantation capitalism, I think we're keeping those ideas alive, and we certainly can see that taking place in this election, this highly contested election, in which we see, the Confederate mentality at work again and being very powerful and very strong, especially in our Senate. So words do matter. Identity does matter, and I do believe one has the right to choose how one regards themselves.
Yes, I'd like to also comment on this a little bit, and specifically talking about this term white passing, if we can sort of shift and talk about this a little bit. And I think to JQ's points, the idea of white passing is so heavily tied to the colonial project of whiteness, right? Whiteness has always been about protecting whiteness. We can see this by looking at the laws on the books in New Orleans up until, relatively recently, about who is considered which race. The whole idea of one drop, and this idea that we have to quantify blood in order to explain an identity. And so for me personally, in my own research, my own life as a lighter skinned Euro featured individual who's often read as white or white adjacent, I don't like the term white passing, because I think it reinforces the idea that a physical body is presenting as something that we understand it to not be, or that there's some sort of stigma tied to that. And so instead, what I think is really interesting, and this is sort of where I draw on literature from critical mixed race studies, is that the body is not the responsibility of the person who has it, right? It's not my job to explain to you how to understand my body. It's our societal idea of being obsessed with looking at a body and being able to race it, or being able to understand it in terms of this cultural construct that we understand as race. And I also find helpful the idea of street race. So this is a fantastic point that Dr. Nancy Lopez, I believe is her name, who worked with collaborators on this study to talk about the idea of when you walk down the street, there is a race that every single person will ascribe to you that could contradict depending on how you look. There is also the idea that there is a way that you understand yourself and that they do not have to match. And it is never the responsibility of the person who inhabits that body to accommodate or to explain that disruption in the racial structure, because we did not create that structure, right? And so I think I'd love to hear more from the panelists on unpacking this idea of white passing a little bit. But the idea of passing, I think for me, having Creole heritage, identifying as Black Creole, is tied with a very cognizant shift of crossing that color line, of making the change for whatever reason, whatever situation was happening, to change race and identify in a different way. And so now, in this moment where we're pushing back against these colonial understandings of race and challenging this that we know is harmful, challenging the idea of white passing or any sort of identification that lends itself to being sneaky or not being full right with yourself or how you identify, I think also has to be challenged in turn.
Yeah, nicely said.
Yeah, I'd love to ask Bailey. So I take your point about that it's not anyone's job to sort of tell people how to interpret them or how to understand their position in the world. But I do think, I guess for me, the white passing kind of term is a sort of shorthand that allows people who are read as white to sort of acknowledge that privilege. And because, white people in general seem like there's a lot of work to do to get them to acknowledge the privilege. And it seems to me a sort of helpful shorthand as a way to reference that, to make a distinction. What to you, does that not play into it for you?
Sure. And when I identify myself, I often say that I'm a mixed race Black woman. That mixed race for me is the way that I hint at that proximity to whiteness and the privilege afforded to me because of that proximity to whiteness. But we can also talk about the fact that within our own larger Black community, identifying as Creole or identifying as having a mixed ancestry can often be read as an act of anti-Blackness. And so for me, saying mixed race and having the body that I live in is acknowledging that there are privileges that I have because of the way that I look. To me, saying white passing is so heavily tied to that legacy of crossing the color line and doing it intentionally. That's not personally how I choose to identify. And I think bring this ties in very heavily to the idea of colorism and needing to have the conversations around color privilege, and sort of getting to Wendy's point in the start of this, the opening remarks of what are the language that we have around skin texture, skin tone, hair texture, the combination as it relates to privilege. So I think all of these are, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And so that's why when I identified myself first as a human being. Okay. And I think that's our common point. There's not a whole lot of things we can agree on, on this planet right now, but we should be able to agree on our humanity. And with that humanity should come some very basic things like dignity and respect. Because we've lost that, because we've othered, and that's what I mean by when we sever that connection to humanity, you other. And once you other, you say you are not part of the body, you're not part of us, then you open Pandora's box. And then you have the possibilities for all the horrors we've seen in the last 500 years. So that's why this kind of opportunity, we have to continue. These kinds of dialogues are so critically important so that we can talk this out and reconnect to our humanity. And part of that's going to have to be about developing new language. We develop new language all the time. All the scientific language that we've developed in the last few years did not exist 50 years ago, didn't exist, okay? Well, we're at a stage of development within this world population in which the blending of it has put us in an opportunity to recreate language about how we identify ourselves. And I think making that connection human first, and then through dialogue, I can ask you your story and you can tell me, so I don't have to make assumptions about who you are. I can ask the question and get the direct answer.
And I think that's,
No, please, Bailey.
Thank you. I think to get to JQ's point about language is so important in this moment about creating new language. One of the reasons why I bring in critical mixed race studies and put Creole identity and history in conversation with other mixed race communities and narratives and histories is because I think often in this country, we have a historical erasure. We don't like to think of things or remember things that have happened. But one of the things that's important to note is that mixed race individuals are people who identify as multi-ethnic, multiracial, biracial, are the fastest growing group of Americans in the country. This is research that's been proven. The Pew Research Center has a fantastic large study on the trajectory of mixed race populations in the United States. And so one of the things that I'm very passionate about in this conversation that we're having largely about the multiculturalism or the mixed race moment in the United States is bringing the Creole narrative there, because I think that that is so important as a historical precedent of mixture that has existed. Mixture is not new. And for us to use the language of the colonial oppressors that created this structure to serve them, and then to to not then partake in the conversation that is existing now and that is going to continue to exist about how we understand mixture as it becomes more visible and larger in the country is to do a disservice to ourselves and our Creole heritage and identity. So just to JQ's point on the language, it is absolutely important that we are having these conversations and also propelling this forward as we work on what it means to be Creole today in this anti-racism moment, and also what the future of these racial conversations will look like.
Yes, and speaking of language, so far this is very dynamic. Speaking of language, when I was growing up in Southern California, my grandparents used the term Creole. I never heard the term Creole of color in my upbringing. I read Creole of color in a history book when I was in undergraduate school, but the term wasn't really used by my family, but some of us do use that term. So one of our participants has asked us to sort of explain what is the difference between a Creole of color and a Creole, and why make this distinction? Would someone like to address that?
This
Bailey,
might be
would you like
Bailey,
to
you're
address it?
probably.
Oh, go ahead.
Sure, sorry, Bliss.
No, I was saying, Bailey, I think this is right up your alley, right?
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. So for me, I use Creole and Creole of color and Black Creole almost interchangeably, but they do mean different things. And so it's important to note that Creole as a term has historically been used in two different ways. In one way, it was used to mark United States born descendants of the original white French colonizers. That term has largely fallen off, as the idea of Creole being a type of Black American or African American ethnic experience is generally what we prioritize. And so when we say Creole, the way that I understand it, and I believe that the way that most of the folks that I've spoken to understand it, when I've asked for, in interviews for folks to define Creole, it is a mixture of often blood, and it's usually cited as African blood, Spanish blood, French blood, and Native blood. And so again, that's a colonizer definition of Creole. For me, I like to think of it as a type of mixed race Black or African American experience. And so how I identify between Creole, Creole of color, Black Creole is ultimately dependent on how the individual identifies themselves. And that's what I honor, at least in my own research. For me, I go by Creole, Creole of color, Black Creole. They all work for me and for my family members who identify.
Bliss, I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something, or if you were introducing Bailey.
Yeah, I was trying to pull Bailey in because I know that this is her area of research, but I am interested in the term Creole, because I think like in my world, my father, because my family left in 1926 and my dad was only 6, and then his family kind of lost some of their Creole identity when they moved to Brooklyn because it didn't exist in a context. And I had family members, I'm sure many of the people coming, who were dispersed because of Hurricane Katrina, and talked to them, where I think they had a real sense of loss, not just for New Orleans, but for this context in which they made sense as a Creole when they were left. So I wonder about the idea of like kind of appropriating the term Creole. I guess I'd love to hear more about what you see as a possibility of this kind of understanding of Creole, because when I bring it up, people just think of, like light-skinned Black people from New Orleans. That's the sort of go-to thing. Or they think of like Haitian Creole. They, some more sophisticated people think about, it meaning a kind of a mixed old and new world identity, but they do associate it always with light skin. And I just wonder if it's possible to divorce that notion from the term.
I think that's a super important point, and definitely something that I should have noted when I was defining Creole, is that the term Creole is a term that we see throughout the Caribbean, through Latin America, even into South America, and it really means mixture. And it's often tied to the colonial project of transporting enslaved people, and also mixture within those different class or caste systems, depending on the cultural context. There's a large body of literature that looks at Creolization, at least in anthropology, and I'm sure in history and other fields as well, that looks at mixture in different ways. And many folks are identified just as Creole. When I use Creole, I'm specifically speaking to the Louisiana context and New Orleans context of it, and using it as an ethnic marker.
All right, thank you. So speaking of Latin America, we do have several questions and in the Q&A. So one of those questions is, it has to do with sort of broadening the context of Creole. And so, so one question is, in what ways are Creoles part of a broader Afro-Latin diaspora? And the second question is, can we expand our idea of Creole by considering indigeneity and Native American cultural experiences, contributions, influences? And I think that this speaks exactly to what we were just saying, that there's a Louisiana Creole, there are understandings of Louisiana Creole, but Creole is a much broader historical phenomenon of mixture, not just quote unquote genetic mixture, but cultural mixture, linguistic hybridity. Does someone want to address those two questions about broadening and contextualizing?
Well, I'll present something that hopefully everybody else can draw on. And that is, you know, I mentioned earlier this notion of the singular plural. And it's a construct that I think is very helpful in terms of one understanding one's own lived experience, because we certainly are singularities. There's nobody like us on the planet. But we're also social creatures, which means we bump in frequently to other singularities, okay, which then forms plurality, okay? But as you know, the great Miles Davis would say, you know, I play the space between the notes. I don't play the notes. I play the space between the notes. And so I think that's where identity is in that space in between. And so it gives us that possibility, that fluidity to be able to model what we believe a Creole is, if that is the identity you claim, okay? And then that juxtaposes to other singularities and the possibility for infinitely wonderful discussions. But when that occurs, just like in this place that we're holding right now in this time and space, we have quite a community that is here, and it's affirming in very special ways, individual ways, but affirming nonetheless in the group that Creole is alive and well, certainly in a place called New Orleans. And so that can carry with a singularity into other pluralities. So if one goes to the islands, or if one goes to South America, you can encounter other Creoles bringing your singularity to their plurality and then work the space between.
Thank you. So I would like to bridge to a question from your comments, JQ. One person has asked about understanding that race and that cultural identities, that there are blendings, all sorts of blendings. It's very common. And so is race useful? Can it be a useful concept as we move forward and as we consider overcoming these problems of the past and promoting social justice? Is race even a useful category to use?
It's useful to dismantle it. That's where its use is, so that we can identify what needs to be deconstructed. So if it appears in forms of policies or laws, we can point to it, we can identify it, okay? I'm especially concerned about our census and how people identify, and how there's way too much forced choice on that census. And we know it's often used not to our advantage, but to our disadvantage, okay? And so once again, it is supposed to be a process in which the people have an opportunity to identify themselves and their pluralities. In other words, their groups. And that certainly has been part of the experience of the diaspora, because we're named so many different things in the census over time. It's just it's uncanny, okay? Whereas you see a tremendous rigidity of change within whiteness. And so when we're talking about what we have to deal with, C.T. Vivian often said the problem was not with quote unquote the people of color. The problem was with white people who gave non-whites, and I just hate to even use that language, but gave non-whites the situation that they're in. And so, it's incumbent that we help folks begin to identify themselves in ways that connect us and not divide us. Race is a divider. That's what it does. It others us. And when it others us hierarchically, we suffer from it.
Yeah, to sort of echo what JQ said, race, and as he spoke on earlier, race was a tool to make distinctions between groups of people for capitalism, for this labor pool, so you could ethically in air quotes, right, exploit certain people for different gains for others. So race as a concept is always going to involve trauma. It's always going to involve oppression. However, I also want to bring up that the reason that I like to define race as a social construct with lived realities is because our race can also change when we go to different cultures, when we go to different countries, when we go to different social constructions, which illustrates just how subjective understandings of race are. And so the question of is race useful? What can we do with race? Is to focus on those lived realities. So what does it mean in our social construction to live in a quote unquote ambiguous body? That is often something that I hear Creoles bring up. What does it mean to live in a lighter skinned body right now? What does that shared experience look like? And what in that positioning of that lived reality that you have with this category of race can you then use to speak back to the oppressions that we're seeing also under this same category? So is it a useful concept? No, but it's unfortunately probably not going anywhere anytime soon. And if you note on the census for this year, the 2020 census, you were able to write in your own ethnic identity, right? For hopefully everybody filled it out, but if you filled it out, you saw, and the listing, the examples that were listed under each race were very interesting to look at, and how this census defined, okay, who is white? What is an example of white? Who is African American or Black, right? Not distinguishing those terms, putting them together, and who is considered that. So race is constantly changing. What I like to focus on is the lived reality and what we can do in our own realities to address the oppressions that we're seeing for others around this same category.
I would say I agree with a lot of the points that Bailey and JQ brought up. I mean, I think the hard part is that because race impacts a lot of people's lived experiences in the United States still, that it is, we have to measure people's racial identity if we're going to enforce the Voting Rights Act and Fair Housing Act and look at educational equity. If we're not comparing, these things across racial categories, then we're not going to be aware if there's still a discrepancy. So, it's really a kind of tension. As long as race still determines people's opportunities to thrive and achieve, then we need to be able to measure that. At the same time, how do we do that without reifying these categories that are harmful? I mean, I think, I find myself in the position often of being a kind of a translator and with a lot of white people about, kind of oppression and sort of shifting their lens from being so white centered. And there's a common thing about like, well, all lives matter. And I teach my children not to see color. And what I generally say is that I think seeing the way that color has impacted people's lived experiences is a way of acknowledging their humanity. Because if you don't see that, then you're not seeing their experience. You kind of have to see that. So I'm kind of torn about the need for racial categories. I wouldn't support sort of whenever people talk about wanting to look beyond race, it raises red flags for me.
Yes, and someone has, speaking of the census, I'm making connections here. Someone in the chat has asked if the panelists have any thoughts on expanding the categories, the available categories in the census, and what if there were a Creole category in the census? Although the census is not necessarily measuring self-identification, it's putting us into categories that then determine, budgets and things. But does someone have any thoughts on that?
I just want to know whether you're human or not. I mean, that's the first thing I really want to know. And, I know some people are like, oh, well, that's, should be assumed. And I say, well, I don't assume much of anything anymore. You might be an alien. I like to check people's belly buttons just to make sure. So, but I want people to get back to affirming themselves as a human being first. Because if you're looking at me and you see something other than a human, we have a problem. Okay, from the get-go. And so, to me, that's just such a necessary kind of question. I'm more concerned about, were you born in the United States or are you visiting from someplace else? If you're visiting from someplace, how long are you going to be here? So we can reduce this really quickly. And there's still lots of other ways to get the information we need to carry out good deeds and good works, if they're really, truly good deeds and really, truly good works.
I think to speak on this question, should we have a Creole category? And then I actually just saw a comment, and I can't see who posted the comment, but a Creole category affirms the complexity of Creole peoplehood and Creole identities. For some reason, I can't see who's posting them, but I saw that comment. The only reason that I could see would be good to have Creole on a census would be for recognition that this is an ethnic group, right? And I think, this is a whole different TED talk that, that we could go into, but the fact that the state of Louisiana created this identity, and then when it was no longer useful, said, oh, never mind, okay, you are going to be part of the Black American experience, we're not going to acknowledge Creole anymore for the most part. Or if it is, it's in very smaller ways, right? We don't see it on the census. We don't see it discussed largely, aside from honestly, a food marker or a type of cultural expression. So my follow-up question is what would be the purpose of adding multiple different ethnic groups for every ethnic group to the census? Yes, validation, 100%. But I want to go back to the point of the census, right? Which, to Bliss's point, is to impact structural inequalities that we're seeing. Structural issues that we're seeing that are leading to different communities, specifically communities of color and darker skinned communities and schools and networks of individuals being disenfranchised, being underfunded, not given the opportunities that they are deserved to give. And so my first question is, what is the purpose of the census? And my second question would be, how is having a Creole category on the census going to impact your anti-racism work? And that is something that I ask myself, because absolutely I would love to check Creole and say, yes, we're recognized here. It wasn't too long ago that I and my family were only able to check one box, and you couldn't even check more than one box. So the constructions of race as reflected by the census are never how people understand and interpret themselves. Validation would be great, but it's never how people interpret themselves. And this is why I like the idea of the lived reality, because I think this sort of merges JQ's point and Bliss's a little bit with, we need this data for structures and for systems and for information. And also we need to acknowledge the humanity. If we're focusing on the lived realities that we see and that we experience and that others experience, and we are treating them seriously, then we cannot sit by and let oppressions happen. If our lived reality is a privileged one, and we are not engaging with the lived realities of others and how they are navigating in this cultural space and what that means for their physical body and self and humanity, then we are not participating in the anti-racism work that we ought to be.
I also, thank you. I also wanted to mention that I teach courses on race at Xavier. I have taught African American history, and I've taught race in the Americas. They're very, very different things. And I'm always careful to emphasize to my students that while race as a concept, while it was invented recently in history, while it was invented with one purpose, the brilliant thing about exploited and oppressed people is that they redefine things. And so while Blackness may have been a racial category that was invented to limit people and to oppress people and to say, okay, the people who belong in this category are limited, they are disempowered. And then people can take that category and redefine it and say, actually, in resistance to that rule, this category can be empowering. This category can represent pride. It can represent beauty. It can represent creativity. And so I tend to lean toward JQ's idea that dismantling race is so very important. And at the same time, as an historian, I recognize the brilliance in people taking what is meant to oppress them and turning it into something that empowers them.
Survival tool.
So
When you've been oppressed for 500 years, you better figure something out. Okay.
Absolutely.
I think, though, that a lot of the work is not just kind of figuring out how to dismantle the thing that's been oppressing, but also how to dismantle the system of privilege. And that's white people's job, partly. And I mean, that's why I'm defending slightly my use of this term white passing. But I think for me, wherever I can remind white people of the privilege that they have just by living in a body that isn't read as a minority, I think it's useful. And I think that, you know, that's the work that I'm interested in doing a lot of, and because I find that I'm well positioned to do it because I have, for better or worse, a kind of trust and maybe a relationship having grown up white, but also, you know, being able to identify with the experience of white people, but also be kind of a translator or just an educator for, I mean, I think once you've studied African-American history and Louisiana history, you sort of realize what, you know, how deeply screwed up and embedded the systemic racism our country is. But I don't know, in speaking to a lot of white people, that light has not gone on yet. So I think that it's both things about dismantling the oppression, but also dismantling the privilege.
And, you know, the most important work we have to do is between our own two ears. I can't read your mind, and I never will be able to. I can only guess what you're thinking. But I tell a lot of stories. Okay. I have a lot of narratives about you, Bliss and Bailey. Probably not true, probably not accurate at all, but I got stories. Okay. But what I can do is really work on my own internal dialogue, my own internal system of which, when I see you, I name you, I categorize you. And so I really, really, truly am working on, when I see you, Wendy, I see human first, okay? And really, I have to stop there because I really don't know a whole lot more after that. I don't know gender, you know, I don't know whatever ethnicity, race, and so forth you are. And so what it says to me is, I need to engage you, have a conversation with you in which you can tell me your story. Bailey, you keep talking about lived experience. That's all we have. That's our currency. That's the currency for the world, is our lived experience. But if I have been socialized into believing you have nothing to give, and that's my shorthand, chances are we won't ever have that conversation. And so we have to begin to really build a network of bridges that gives us the inner strength, what Gandhi called soul force, what King called direct action, so that we intervene in that space between, so that we use our singularity and our lived experiences to build that bridge across that space to that other singularity, and make now pluralities that have respect, that have dignity for each other, that have the ability to stay at the table until we get whatever we need, so we stop pulling ourselves down.
So one question that has appeared in the chat is maybe this distinction between lived experience and this desire to see others as humans who deserve all of the same things, but also there are systems, there are institutions that don't have mentalities, right? We as humans do, but there are systems, there are institutions, there's systemic racism, and all sorts of other systemic isms. And so how do we reconcile those things?
I love that question. I think it brings a level of depth to this conversation that's really needed. And one of the reasons why, I said a while ago that race is not something we're going to get rid of. I would love to get rid of it, but the reality of the way that our capitalist structure works is that we like to quantify people. We like percentages. We like to know where everybody fits neatly, even if it's not neat, and it rarely is. And so we have to also take into consideration that there are these larger umbrella terms and categories that we are fitting under, right? Yes, I have a lived experience in my own way, but that also is related to the ethnic experience that I share with others and the racial experience that I share with others. And so, the definition of ethnicity is often, there's several, right? Like race, sometimes it's very tricky to define. One of the things that is usually tied in with ethnicity is the idea that it is some kind of shared cultural experience or shared idea. And so it's very important for that reason that those with these shared ideas are recognized, and that we take that as a type of collective lived experience as well, which is, one of the reasons why things like representation is so important. One of the things that I've been really passionate about is trying to put together lists of children's books that represent tons of different lived experiences, so that the children in my life, right, from whoever they're coming from, have all of these different representations. I think that's just one example of how we push past the idea that lived experience is not all we have, and we can't just view the humanity. We should absolutely start with the humanity and get to those conversations, but often it's about exposure and this larger societal shift to having these conversations. And you're absolutely right, structures, and especially structures that are very common in our country that are built on anti-Blackness and built to support white supremacy, do not necessarily care about humanity, do not necessarily care about lived reality, which is why those race census metrics are important, which is why we have to continue to have the discussions of anti-Blackness, of colorism, of how we show up in this world and how that influences how others treat us. So I think we're all kind of hitting on these points, but there has to be some sort of, at least in my mind, there has to be some sort of middle ground between human first, let's stop there, and we have to have, a very, pristine idea of the census data and the structural classification of everybody. There has to be something in the middle. And I think for me, that middle is where we can have conversations, and that middle is where we can do the work ourselves in our own spaces, in our own communities, to fight back against those issues that show up for us, which for me as a Creole, and understanding the Creole narrative and history that is often shared within this ethnic group, is dealing with anti-Blackness, is dealing with internalized ideas of worth tied to skin color and tied to hair texture, is dealing with a legacy of passing, is dealing with a history that is invoking all of these different things, is providing generational wealth, often along with generational trauma in the same breath, and how we sit with those dichotomies as well. And so I think this is a very messy, complex problem. And for me, the answer lies somewhere in the middle of what we've been discussing.
Good summary.
Yes, and thank you. It's interesting that in many of your comments, you're addressing some of the topics that our participants are curious about. And there's one question that I think is very interesting that anyone can address, and that is the question of Creole as a cultural identity. And can a cultural identity be adopted? And one reason why the question stands out to me is because as a person of Creole ancestry. All four of my grandparents were Creole. So both of my parents are like 100% Creole, as we say. But I grew up in Los Angeles. And so, so Creole for me was a heritage or an ancestry first, before it was my cultural practice. And when I came to New Orleans, I learned very quickly that I was only somewhat Creole, and people reminded me, you're not Creole, you're from California. Okay, so it was a really important lesson for me. So Bliss has sort of addressed this as well with the discovery of being Creole, and Bailey is also talking about the lived experience and street race. You know, we might identify as Creole, but other people don't identify us that way. And can we actually become Creole?
I'll let the Creoles answer that one, okay?
I'll take a take a chance at it. I'm sure everybody listening who identifies as Creole probably is talking to their TV, and I certainly know my parents probably are, and my grandmother probably is, with their answer to this question. Creole, as a definition of a word, means mixture. So this is one of, you know, I don't know if this answers the question, but I'll provide this anecdote as a way to explain further how I'm understanding it. I remember having a conversation early on when I started my research with someone and talking about being Creole, and they said, well, you know, you're only half Creole because your mom is white, you're only half Creole. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Can you explain more about that? Because to me, Creole is mixture. And so if your definition based on the definition of Creole is a mixture of these different types of blood, then how would I then be half of a mixture if I'm with, you know? So and we had this larger conversation on that. And so I think that hits to the cultural understanding of Creole as well. I think for many of us, we conflate the two. We are Creole, and that also brings a cultural definition. What that cultural definition is, again, would be as different as every single person sitting here. You know, I think I refer to, there's a book called Black Cool, 1,000 Streams of Blackness, written by Rebecca Walker. And in the foreword, Henry Louis Gates says there are 1 million Black people in the country, and there are 1 million ways to be Black. And I think that can be the truth about every single ethnic or racial marker that we have. So I won't define what Creole means, but I do want to highlight that I think that there can be a distinction between the ethnic racial identity of Creole and the cultural identity of Creole. And I think that every family has their own narrative and definition that goes along with that absolutely should be respected and treated as the correct one.
All right, so thank you for that. I also wanted to address another question in the chat. Christina Rigo has written, can the panel speak on the notion of shifting the discussion with white people from how we identify to how they identify? Since race is a social construct, white people have also experienced a loss of culture by adopting a racial identifier that is associated with white supremacy. Does someone want to address that question?
I'll just start it, and others can join in real quickly. I don't know if anybody saw President Trump's proclamation on Columbus Day. Has anybody read it? I really encourage you. Yes, okay, good. I really encourage you, if you haven't, to get it and read it, because it's really powerful in terms of, once again, let's redefine the narrative in a very narrow way so that only whiteness prevails. So there's no counter narrative. So he's against you know, people like Zen and Takaki and anyone who has wrote a counter narrative to the history of our country. And I think that's very, very dangerous, okay? Because we should be able to tell our stories, and regardless of whether they fit with the dominant caste or class. They have a story to tell, we have a story to tell, and we really need to protect the rights to make sure we are able to tell that story.
To go along with that and try and address this question as well. I think we could have a whole 2-hour, 3-hour discussion on this question as well. I do want to say that. But briefly, race, as we've said and established, was established as a white supremacist tool, as a way to keep people out and keep other people in. And so sorry, I wrote some notes I'm referring to down here to make sure I had all of my thoughts written down. So white defined folks, or folks who are defined as white in this moment right now, feeling, I guess, an intense disconnect between their identity being now tied to white supremacist alt-right narratives and sort of those being swapped or used interchangeably. I'm noticing a shift to identify for many white people as their ethnic identity, where their family's from, which I think is great. I think we should all have the opportunity to have more nuanced identities and to be able to understand ourselves more than just a racial notion, right? Getting back to that idea of telling your story. However, and there's a big however or a big but there, that doesn't mean that that excuses the histories and the benefits that white identifying individuals, or those who have been classified and defined as white, have gotten under this structure. And so at the same time as there is this shift to a more nuanced ethnic discussion or looking at your ancestry with the DNA testing and all of that, and that's great, and continue to do that, that's fantastic, along with having this discussion of what a white supremacist structure looks like, how white individuals have benefited in terms of finances, in terms of positions of power, in terms of things even like redlining and voting suppression, right? All of these things that have been done to communities of color that have not necessarily been done to white communities. So I think we are complex humans. We can hold complex things at the same time. And I think this is absolutely one of those dichotomies when we talk about whiteness that has to be discussed right now. And that also, extending that to our white passing Creoles or very light complected Creoles, for those of us who do have that history of white passing, we also have a responsibility to hold those questions of privilege and potentially even those questions of, different benefits that we may have received because of our ancestors going and doing these types of crossing the color line, or the fact that we perhaps were born with a skin tone that puts us in a closer position to whiteness than other individuals. So, we haven't focused too much on anti-Black rhetoric and internalized anti-Blackness in this panel, but I think, this is when we're talking about whiteness, it's also a great time to bring that up, that for those who identify as Creoles and who have these often have these, at least in my family, have these family histories of whiteness and of the project of whiteness and of participating in structures that are oppressing others, we also have that responsibility to then look internally and work to dismantle or to address those inequalities that have been caused from the structures that have benefited us in the same sort of way that white folks would with their white privilege.
I completely agree, Bailey. I think that, I used to, when I first found out about my father passing and my own ancestry, and was wrestling with the idea of the white privilege that my father had afforded us. I mean, he moved to Fairfield, Connecticut, the wealthiest county in the United States at the time. And I mean, it was very purposeful. He wanted to, if he was going to be white, he wanted to get all of that privilege for his children. And I used to say, well, what am I supposed to do? It's not like I can give my privilege back. But in fact, you can, there's lots of ways that people, whether they're white or white presenting and have been benefited from some of that privilege, can step back, can share their privilege, can be active in dismantling this system. So I really appreciate that point.
Yes, I also appreciate the same point. And I would like to also remind us all that while there's maybe in some communities, there's commonality of physical appearance, that there are other communities where there's another commonality of physical appearance. And I'm always reminded of that the assumption of Creole with a lightness of skin is something that feeds white supremacy and it feeds the notion of Creole as a status of privilege, whereas not all Creoles experience that privilege. There are Creoles of all sorts of experiences, of poverty, of lack of healthcare, lack of educational achievement, and all of our shades of skin that represent the Creole population. So I would like to say thank you to all of the panelists. It is 5:33. And so, so Bailey, JQ, Bliss, you all are all really brilliant. And I'm very fortunate to have been able to listen to this. I've benefited from it. I will incorporate your wisdom and give you credit as always. And so thank you, everyone. And I believe before we log off, Chantel would like to give us some closing instructions or closing suggestions. And thank you so much to everybody. Thank you.
Wow. All right. Thank you, everybody. What a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Very pertinent, very informative. Thank you, Dr. Golden. Thank you, Dr. Adams, Ms. Broyard, and Ms. Duhay for sharing with us your expertise and your experiences and your visions. Again, thank you to all the participants, members and visitors for today's webinar event. Apologies in case a question or a statement didn't get addressed. In the essence of time, we couldn't, but just note that this webinar was recorded and we will have it available soon on our website. There's also a conference evaluation that you might see on your screen. So if you get the moment, please consider filling that out and submitting it. That would be very helpful to us for feedback. I would also like to extend an invitation to everyone to visit our website at www.lacreole.org. You can find an assortment of information on us, including our definitions about Creole and history, and information about our membership. We would love for you to join us. La Creole is a nonprofit family research and educational organization, and we want to do our part to build legacies, but inspire everyone and anyone in a celebration of Creole culture. There is a space for donations, by the way, and also some very amazing resources that we have on site, which supports us in the long run. We've got an assortment of journals, and we have actually a newly released publication called Family Legacies, and something you would really enjoy about people's personal stories and experiences. So you can follow us on Facebook at Louisiana Creole Research Association. And again, check our website. And most of all, thank you once again, merci beaucoup, from La Creole. Conference evaluation, please.